Scandal in a private school. A racist teacher destroys a child's dignity with unforgivable humiliations. He corners him, ridicules him, and ruins his life. But he had no idea who he was messing with. When he finds out that the boy's brother is LeBron James, his world falls apart. How did this story of abuse and revenge end? You have to see it. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Does anyone know the answer? Asked Professor Miller, scanning the classroom. Silence. A couple of students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Malik raised his hand. Yes, Malik? Miller crossed his arms, expectant. It's 144, because... Incorrect. Miller interrupted him immediately. He frowned and sighed. I suppose you just guessed, didn't you? Malik blinked, confused. No, sir. I solved it mentally. I don't think so, Miller shook his head. This was too complicated for someone like you. A murmur spread through the classroom. Some students looked at each other. Others simply lowered their gaze. Malik felt a tightness in his chest. He looked around, hoping for support, but found only silence. He lowered his gaze. What was the point of arguing? He knew he was right, but it didn't matter. If he insisted, Miller would only humiliate him further. He felt heat on his face, not from embarrassment, but from contained rage. Anyway, Miller continued, ignoring him completely. Let's move on with the lesson. I hope that over time, some of you will learn to think before you speak. Soft laughter. Not from everyone, but from enough. Malik clenched his fists onto the desk. No one said anything. No one defended him. No one questioned the teacher. Miller turned to the board and began writing the next equation, as if nothing had happened, as if he were right. Miller scanned the classroom with a mocking smile. He leaned against the desk and shook his head. I must admit, Malik, it was a good attempt. But let's be realistic. People like you don't usually excel in mathematics. Luck was on your side this time. Let's see if you can repeat it. Miller resumed the lesson as if nothing had happened. He walked back and forth, writing equations on the board and throwing questions at the students. His tone was casual, as if he hadn't just humiliated a student in front of everyone. Malik kept his eyes down. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk so tightly that they hurt. He wanted to speak. He wanted to tell Miller that he was wrong, that he was good at math, that it wasn't luck. But the words got stuck in his throat. He knew that any response would only give the teacher more reason to continue his mockery, disguised as teaching. From the right row, a classmate watched him. Malik noticed from the corner of his eye and quickly looked away. He didn't want pity. He didn't want comfort. He just wanted to disappear. Malik raised his hand firmly, his voice clear but controlled. I arrived at that answer by logically applying the remainder theorem. Look, if you observe the... Miller let out an exaggerated sigh and shook his head as if he had just heard nonsense. No, Malik. We already get that you like to try your luck, but what you're doing isn't thinking, it's guessing. His tone was mocking, and a few nervous chuckles were heard in the class. For insisting on that, I'm deducting points from your grade. Mathematics is exact, and there's no room for excuses here. Malik's stomach sank. His instinct screamed at him to defend himself, to protest, to demand to be evaluated fairly. But as soon as he saw Miller's expression, he understood that it didn't matter what he said. The man wouldn't listen. No one would. From the back of the classroom, a barely perceptible voice broke the silence. That's not fair. Miller ignored the comment. He picked up his marker and turned to the board, as if nothing had happened. Let's move on. Next problem. I hope this time someone can solve it without performing magic. Malik didn't turn his head to see who had spoken, but he felt it. A small spark of support, of resistance. He clung to that feeling as Miller continued with the lesson, his voice echoing like a hollow sound in his mind. Something had to change. The recess bell rings, and Malik walks into the hallway with his shoulders tense. He knows some of his classmates are going to approach him. He's not sure if that makes him feel better or worse. "Forget it, Malik. It's not your fault," says Jordan, patting him on the shoulder. "That guy's an asshole," adds Lucas, arms crossed. Malik nods, but says nothing. Maybe Miller is right. A voice rises behind them. Malik turns and sees 3 boys leaning against the lockers, smirking. "Excuse me?" Jordan asks, frowning. "Come on, it's obvious," one of them replies, shrugging. "Some people just aren't good at math. It's not their fault, it's just, the way it is." The other 2 laugh and nod. Malik feels anger rising in his throat, but he swallows it down. He's not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing that it affects him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replies as neutrally as he can. "I have one of the best grades in the class." "Sure," the first one says sarcastically. "But not because you're smart. You're just lucky. There's always someone who has to be the exception." Malik feels like he can't breathe. They say it so naturally, as if they truly believe it's impossible for someone like him to be brilliant at math. As if his effort meant nothing. "Drop it already," Jordan says, stepping in front of Malik. "What's the problem?" "We're just saying what everyone thinks," the other replies with a grin. With one last glance, the group walks away laughing, tossing comments between themselves. "Idiots," Lucas mutters, arms still crossed. Malik doesn't respond. His mind is elsewhere. He's not surprised by what they say anymore, but that doesn't mean it hurts any less. He just wants the day to end as quickly as possible. The classroom door closed behind the last student who entered. Miller, with his usual expression of superiority, walked slowly toward the board while the students took out their notebooks. Without warning, he turned his head toward Malik. "You to the front. Now." The murmuring in the classroom stopped. Malik stood up cautiously, feeling the weight of all the eyes on him. His steps echoed on the floor as he walked toward the board. Miller wrote out an extensive problem with calculated movements, then stepped back and crossed his arms. "You have 2 minutes to solve it," he said with a barely concealed smile. Malik swallowed hard. He knew the others were given much more time, but he said nothing. He picked up the chalk and began writing quickly. His mind worked at full speed, trying to ignore the tension in the room. He calculated, noted, verified, but the clock moved forward mercilessly. 30 seconds, Miller announced, pretending to check his watch. Malik clenched his teeth. The pressure was suffocating. He rushed through the last steps, feeling the sweat on his palms. He finished just as Miller clapped his hands to mark the end of the time. Malik let go of the chalk and stepped back, trying to hide his heavy breathing. Miller approached and scanned the solution with his eyes. Suddenly, he smiled coldly and tapped a part of the calculation with the chalk. "Oh well, it looks like our genius has made a mistake." There were muffled giggles in the room. Malik felt a chill down his spine. Frowning, he quickly reviewed his work. It was a minor mistake, a digit swapped for another in the last step. Something anyone could have done. But not everyone was being judged like he was. "I suppose rushing isn't good for everyone," Miller continued, in an exaggeratedly condescending tone. Some of the laughter grew louder. Malik felt his face burn, but he kept his gaze down. He returned to his seat without saying a word, each step weighing on him as if he were crossing a minefield. When he sat down, he could barely hear the teacher continuing the lesson. Everything inside him was silent. His heart pounded fast. His mind replayed every second of the humiliation. At the back of a room, someone murmured something unintelligible, but the laughter drowned out any attempt at support. Malik looked at his hands. He had made a mistake, but the biggest mistake of all was thinking Miller would stop. Malik doesn't raise his hand, not because he doesn't know the answer, but because there's no point in answering anymore. Every time he did, Miller found a way to humiliate him. Now, instead of looking forward, he keeps his eyes on his notebook, drawing meaningless lines. His fingers grip the pencil tighter than necessary. His breathing is slow, contained. No one seems to notice, but he feels the weight of every second in that room. Weeks go by, and Malik's grades start to drop. At first, just a few points. Nothing too noticeable. But then, the decline becomes more evident. The numbers on his tests no longer reflect his talent. He makes mistakes in things he used to do easily. He doesn't check his work. He doesn't bother correcting. Miller sees it and says nothing. He doesn't need to. His silence is a victory. One day, Malik receives his latest exam, a 78. He had never scored below 90 in math. His stomach tightens when he sees the grade. He wants to ignore it, but he can't. It feels like a punch to the chest. Like everything Miller has said to him is written in red ink on the paper. As he leaves the classroom, he hears some of his classmates talking about the test. Their names are among the highest scores. Names that had never been above his before. He grips the paper tightly and keeps walking, without saying a word. Jordan sat next to Malik on the bench in the courtyard, watching him as he stared at the ground. For weeks now, his friend hadn't been the same. Before, Malik would talk endlessly about math, about the difficult problems he solved almost effortlessly. Now he didn't even lift his head when others talked. "What's going on with you, man?" Jordan finally asked. Malik shrugged. "Nothing." "Don't lie to me. I've known you since kindergarten. Something's up. It's Miller, isn't it?" Malik's silence confirmed it. Jordan took a deep breath and continued. "Look, I know you're strong and all that, but you don't have to carry this alone. Talk to someone." Malik shook his head immediately. "It's nothing. Seriously. I'm fine." "You're not fine." Jordan insisted. "You don't participate in class, you barely talk, and we've all seen what that guy does to you." "Malik, this isn't right." Malik frowned. He felt trapped. Telling the truth meant admitting he couldn't handle it, that Miller was winning. But something in Jordan's gaze made him hesitate. Jordan wasn't judging him. He just wanted to help. "I don't know if I want to talk about this," he admitted in a low voice. "That's already something," Jordan said. "Just think about this. If it were the other way around, if it were me, would you let me go through this alone?" Malik didn't answer right away. He knew the answer. He would never have let his best friend go through something like this without helping. He sighed and leaned back against the bench. His throat felt tight, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the weight of everything he had been holding in. "All right," he murmured. "I'll talk to LeBron." Jordan nodded approvingly. "Good. Because if anyone can do something, it's him." Malik pushed the front door open. His shoulders slumped. His backpack, which used to bounce with energy on his back, now hung limply from one arm. His mother was in the kitchen, but he walked past without saying a word. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want questions. He just wanted to get to his room, close the door, and forget about the day. But in the living room, LeBron was lounging on the couch, remote in hand, the TV on at low volume. Malik felt a pang in his chest. He had decided to talk to his brother, but now that he was right there, everything inside him screamed at him to stay quiet, to forget it, to not make a scene. But something also told him that if he didn't speak now, he never would. He dropped onto the other end of the couch. He said nothing, just stared ahead, pressing his lips together. LeBron noticed immediately that something was wrong. "What's up, little bro?" "Malik," he insisted in a calm voice. "Are you okay?" The boy took a deep breath, felt the pressure in his chest, and let the air out slowly. He closed his eyes for a moment, searching for words that didn't seem to come. But then, like a dam breaking, the first syllables slipped from his lips. "It's school," he said softly. "It's Miller." LeBron sat up, his eyes sharpened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush him. He just waited. Malik swallowed hard, feeling his heart speed up. "He hates me," he whispered. "He humiliates me in front of everyone. He makes me look like a fool. And now I don't even want to be in his class." The words hung in the air for a moment. LeBron didn't respond right away. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was holding back the fire boiling inside him. Finally, he took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "You did the right thing by telling me this," he said firmly. "This doesn't end here." And in that instant, Malik felt a weight lift from his shoulders. LeBron James remained silent as Malik spoke. He listened to every word, every pause, every break in his brother's voice. But as the story progressed, his muscles tensed. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. A teacher humiliating his younger brother in public, allowing others to mock him, breaking him down until he doubted himself. LeBron felt the fury begin to grow inside him, a fire impossible to put out. "Are you the only one?" he suddenly asked, his voice firm but controlled. Malik looked up, confused. "What?" he responded in a barely audible voice. "Are you the only one he's done this to?" LeBron insisted, this time more slowly. It couldn't be an isolated case. Someone like Miller wouldn't stop with just one kid. Malik hesitated. He lowered his gaze, fiddling with the edge of his sweatshirt. LeBron knew him well enough to tell he was debating whether to tell the truth or stay silent. "I don't know," Malik finally murmured. "Sometimes I see other kids tense up when he calls on them. Some try to disappear into their seats, like I do. But no one says anything. Everyone acts like it's normal, like they're afraid." LeBron closed his eyes for a moment. This wasn't just about Malik. There were more. And he wasn't going to let it keep happening. LeBron didn't wait. The next morning, he was in front of Malik's school before the doors even opened. He didn't have an appointment. He didn't need one. He had seen enough. His younger brother was being torn down by someone who had no business being in a classroom, and he wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. He walked into the building with a firm stride, heading straight to the principal's office. The secretary, a middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a tired expression, looked at him in surprise. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked in a mechanical tone. "I need to speak with the principal." "Now," LeBron said bluntly. "Do you have an appointment?" The woman started typing on her computer without looking up. "No, but this is urgent. It's about a teacher mistreating students," he replied, placing his hands on the desk. His tone was low, but his presence filled the room. The secretary blinked, finally looking at him properly. Her expression shifted, but she still shook her head. "The principal is busy all morning. If you'd like, I can schedule a meeting for another day." LeBron leaned slightly over the desk. "I can't wait another day. If the principal is busy, then I'll wait. I'm not leaving until I speak with him." The secretary exhaled and glanced at the closed office door. Then she looked back at LeBron. She didn't say anything else. She just nodded cautiously and pointed to one of the chairs in the waiting area. LeBron and Malik waited in the hallway. The silence between them was tense. Malik shifted in his seat while his brother kept his arms crossed, watching the principal's office door with an inscrutable expression. That was when Miller appeared. He walked with a carefree air, holding a couple of folders under his arm. His eyes scanned the hallway and landed on Malik. He smirked with disdain. Well, what a surprise to see you here," he said in a condescending tone. I suppose some students need sponsors to move forward. There are those who never learn to do it on their own." LeBron didn't react immediately. He merely observed him with a steady gaze, analyzing every word the man dropped like poison. He didn't blink, didn't look away. His silence was an impenetrable wall. Miller, unaware of whom he was talking to, continued. "It's always the same," he went on with a dry laugh. "They put in less effort, yet expect to be treated better. And when things don't go their way, they bring someone else to defend them." Malik lowered his gaze, feeling anger rise within him. The hallway fell into a heavy silence. A few more seconds, and the situation would have escalated. But just at that moment, the principal's office door opened. "Gentlemen, come in," the principal ordered in a firm voice. Miller turned toward the voice, and his expression shifted slightly as he noticed LeBron's stance. He still didn't fully understand the situation, but his confidence began to waver. LeBron uncrossed his arms, turned, and looked to the principal before stepping into the office. Malik followed him, keeping his eyes on the floor. Miller, still not comprehending, furrowed his brow and followed them inside. The principal entered the office with a frown and a cup of coffee in hand. He looked exhausted, as if this were just another problem in an endless list of school conflicts. He barely looked up as he sat behind his desk. "Well, what is this about?" he asked, flipping through some papers without much interest. LeBron placed his hands on the desk and leaned slightly forward. "I'm LeBron James, Malik's brother," he said firmly. The principal immediately raised his head, blinking a couple of times, as if he had just processed the name. His expression changed, and suddenly, he seemed much more attentive. "Oh, Mr. James, I wasn't expecting your visit," he stammered, setting the coffee aside. "I didn't give notice because this couldn't wait," LeBron continued, not giving him time to react. "Malik has been discriminated against in this school by Mr. Miller. My brother was an outstanding student in mathematics. Now, he doesn't even want to come to class. Do you know why? Because Miller has done everything possible to humiliate and discourage him. And I have proof." The principal quickly glanced at Miller, who remained silent with his arms crossed. Then he turned back to LeBron. "Proof?" he asked, straightening in his chair. LeBron pulled out his phone and swiped the screen. Audio recordings, manipulated grade reports, testimonies from other students. He placed it on the principal's desk. "Check Malik's records," he said, not taking his eyes off the principal. "Look at his performance before this year and compare it to now. Tell me if that seems normal to you." The principal, visibly uncomfortable, turned his chair toward the computer and began typing. His face changed as he reviewed the data. There was no way to justify what he was seeing. Malik had gone from being one of the top students in his class to being on the verge of failure in a matter of months. It made no sense, unless he had been sabotaged. Miller remained motionless, frowning. His arms were still crossed, and his jaw was tense. He didn't say a word. He knew that anything he said at that moment would only make things worse for him. The principal quickly took notes. His fingers drummed against the desk as he processed the information. He knew this wouldn't stay within the walls of his office. This was bigger than a simple student complaint. And with LeBron James involved, it was turning into something much more serious. The silence in the office was heavy. Miller huffed and crossed his legs, as if the situation seemed like nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He looked at the principal, and then at LeBron, before forcing a tense smile. "Look, this is all a misunderstanding," he said in a controlled voice. "All I've tried to do is bring out the best in Malik. Some students need an extra dose of pressure to perform at their best." LeBron narrowed his eyes, not moving from his seat. Malik, sitting beside him, kept his gaze down, his shoulders tense. The principal took notes without saying a word. "Oh, really?" LeBron asked calmly. "And have you used this same technique with other top students? Because if this were truly your method, we'd expect to see a lot of students complaining that you humiliate them, wouldn't we?" Miller pressed his lips together. He glanced at the window and then back at LeBron. He took a second that was just a little too long before responding. "Every student is different. Some need different approaches," he mumbled, without the same confidence as before. LeBron let out a short, dry laugh. "Different approaches?" he repeated. "You don't have any other stories like Malik's, do you? Not a single other brilliant student you've tried to help improve this way? Or am I wrong?" The teacher swallowed. He shifted in his chair and shook his head. "This has been a misunderstanding," he insisted, without answering the question. "Everything has been taken out of context." The principal set his pen down on the desk and stared at him. "We'll see about that," he said coldly. Then he looked between LeBron and Malik. "I think we have enough information for today." Miller opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. There was no trace left of his initial arrogance on his face. The principal clasped his hands on the desk, observing LeBron with a neutral expression. But as soon as the player slid the documents across the table, his demeanor changed. "Here are Malik's grades," LeBron said, his voice firm. "Look at the difference. Before this semester, he had an impeccable record. Then, all of a sudden, he starts failing exams. His average drops. Coincidence? I don't think so." The principal took the documents and began reviewing them. His eyes narrowed as he flipped from one page to another, murmuring under his breath. "This is—" He muttered, but he didn't finish the sentence. His fingers drummed on the table as he shook his head from side to side. Miller, standing to the side, crossed his arms and leaned slightly forward. "Numbers aren't everything," he said in a condescending tone. "Malik is a talented kid, yes, but sometimes he needs additional discipline, high expectations. Not all students respond the same way to the same method." LeBron let out a dry laugh. "Discipline," he repeated, leaning toward him. "Is that what you call humiliating him in front of the class? Docking his grades for no reason? Ignoring it when his classmates mock him? Explain to me why your method only applies to him and not to other students." The principal, without looking up, ran his index finger down the column of grades in another file. Then he picked up another one and compared. "This isn't just Malik," he finally said. "There are other names here. Grades that have dropped drastically in similar patterns." He raised his eyes to Miller. "How do you explain this?" Miller didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened, and the shadow of a smile disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. He shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "Every student is different," he murmured. "Not all of them can handle academic rigor." The principal didn't seem convinced. His fingers tightened around his pen, and he began taking notes on a yellow sheet of paper. Each stroke of ink felt like a hammer blow in the silent room. Miller watched without saying a word. His posture was still defiant, but his eyes darted quickly, as if searching for an escape he couldn't find. "I'm going to need more information," the principal finally said. "But this doesn't look good for you, Mr. Miller." Miller remained silent. For the first time in the entire meeting, he seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. The principal closed Malik's grade folder and fixed his gaze on Miller. His expression was serious. "You have to admit that there's something about all this that isn't right," he said firmly. Miller narrowed his eyes. His jaw tightened. He seemed to be debating whether to respond with another excuse or remain silent. His rigid, defiant posture betrayed that he still refused to accept the gravity of the situation. LeBron crossed his arms. He didn't take his eyes off Miller. He doesn't have anything to admit because he knows exactly what he's been doing, he interjected. And now, when confronted, he's at a loss for words. The principal sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm going to investigate this further, he announced. This isn't a matter that can be taken lightly. If there are more cases like Malik's, I need to know. LeBron nodded, though his expression remained stern. I hope you do, because I'm not going to let this go unpunished. The principal stood up and extended his hand. LeBron, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. It's not every day that someone like you takes the time to come here and fight for what's right. LeBron shook his hand, though his gaze remained locked on Miller. This isn't about me. It's about my brother and all the kids who have gone through this in silence. The principal gestured toward the door. I'm going to need to speak with the teacher alone. This isn't over, but I want to handle it properly. LeBron looked at Miller one last time before nodding and walking toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced at the principal. I'll be watching what happens here. Don't let this end in just words. The principal met his gaze without blinking. I won't. The door closed behind LeBron, leaving the principal and Miller alone in the office. The silence was tense. The principal sat down again, opening the folder with the records. His fingers drummed on the desk before he looked up. Now let's talk seriously, Miller. And I want you to tell me the truth. LeBron left the principal's office with Malik by his side. He didn't say anything, but his jaw was tense. Malik, still nervous, glanced at him sideways. They both walked down the hallway, but LeBron deliberately slowed his pace. He had no intention of leaving just yet. From where they stood, they could hear the sound of raised voices inside the office. They couldn't make out all the words, but it was clear that Miller wasn't taking the situation well. This is ridiculous, Miller bellowed. All this over a spoiled brat. The principal responded in a firm tone, though it was less audible. LeBron noticed how Malik's expression changed. He bit his lower lip, holding back the mix of emotions overwhelming him. Suddenly, the door swung open forcefully, and the principal walked out in hurried steps, his brow furrowed and a phone in his hand. He didn't stop to look at LeBron or Malik. He walked straight toward the school's administrative wing. LeBron didn't hesitate. Stay here for a moment, he whispered to Malik before following the principal with long, determined strides. From a safe distance, he watched the principal enter a teacher's lounge. Inside, 3 teachers sat around a table. They all fell silent when they saw him walk in. I need your help, declared the principal bluntly. I'm going to ask some questions, and I want honest answers. No more silence. One of the teachers, a man with graying hair and thick glasses, cleared his throat. About Miller, I assume. The principal nodded. He took out a folder with documents and placed it on the table. We know there have been complaints before. I need to know what you have seen with your own eyes. LeBron narrowed his eyes. From his position, he could see the tension on the teachers' faces. One of them, a woman with short hair and an uncomfortable expression, crossed her arms. Miller has always been strict, she said cautiously. But yes, there have been incidents. With Malik and with others. The principal leaned on the table. Can you be more specific? The woman averted her gaze, but then sighed. A month ago, a student turned in a perfect test. Miller gave him a C, without explanation. When the boy asked why, he just said that he didn't have the attitude for an A. LeBron clenched his fists. Another teacher nodded slowly. I've seen him belittle certain students in the classroom, he admitted. Mockery disguised as sarcastic comments. It's a pattern. The principal took notes in a notebook and then looked up. I want names, dates, any details you can give me. The teachers exchanged glances. One by one, they began to speak. The principal walked down the hallway with a firm stride, unaware that LeBron was following closely behind. Every movement of the principal was watched intently by the students nearby. Murmurs began to rise among the students as they noticed LeBron walking behind him. It didn't take long for the inevitable to happen. "LeBron, thank you for speaking up for us," a student called out from a crowd. The comment unleashed a wave of voices that joined the clamor. Several students took the opportunity to raise their voices about the abuses they had suffered at the hands of Mr. Miller. A first-year student, her face flushed with indignation, raised her hand. "My older brother went through this too when he studied here," she said firmly. Miller treated him the same way. No one listened to him at the time. The principal came to an abrupt stop. He slowly turned to look at the students who had gathered behind him. His face was unreadable, but he pulled out a notebook and began taking notes. He wrote quickly, recording every testimony the students gave with restrained fury. LeBron watched the scene in silence. He didn't need to intervene. The students were speaking for themselves. He had managed to ignite a spark, and now the flame was impossible to extinguish. From a corner of the hallway, Miller observed the scene with his arms crossed. His expression grew increasingly rigid. He said nothing, but his jaw was tightly clenched. He knew what all of this meant. The pressure was reaching its peak, and there was no possible escape. The principal shut the notebook with a sharp snap and looked up. His eyes locked onto Miller, who maintained his composure, though his fingers trembled slightly. There was no need for words. Miller knew the situation was becoming unsustainable. The silence in the hallway was dense, heavy. No one moved. LeBron crossed his arms, observing every detail. The moment of truth was near. The principal leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The eyes in the office were fixed on him, waiting for his decision. LeBron watched him with his arms crossed, while Miller drummed his fingers against the table impatiently. "As of this moment, you are suspended," the principal announced, looking Miller directly in the eyes. "Until the investigation is concluded, you cannot continue teaching at this school." Miller blinked several times, as if he hadn't fully understood the words. His jaw tightened, and in a sudden movement, he stood up. "Suspended? This is ridiculous." His voice rose in pitch. "I've been teaching here for years. Why are you listening to a bunch of lying kids instead of me?" The principal remained firm. He straightened in his chair and pointed at the door with a cold gesture. "This is not a request, Miller. It's an order. You have 5 minutes to gather your things and leave the premises." Miller clenched his fists. His face was flushed with rage. "You can't do this to me," he spat. "This is a witch hunt." The principal did not respond. He simply looked at him, expectant. The tension in the room became unbearable. Miller snorted, shook his head in disdain, and strode out, slamming the door behind him. In the hallways, murmurs began spreading like wildfire. Students stopped in their tracks, exchanging looks of disbelief as they saw Miller walk by with heavy steps and tightly pressed lips. Some whispered among themselves, while others could barely suppress a smile. "Did they kick him out?" a student asked in a low voice. "Suspended," another whispered. "But he looks furious." The teacher walked on without looking at anyone, his gaze fixed on the floor. As he passed, the students' faces reflected something more than just surprise, relief. It was as if an invisible weight had begun to lift from the school. Some even took out their phones, discreetly capturing the moment. LeBron watched everything from a corner of the hallway. His eyes followed Miller until he disappeared through the main door. This wasn't the end, but it was an important step. The principal emerged from his office moments later, frowning and holding a notebook in his hand. He didn't say a word as he walked down the hallway, but his gaze said it all. The matter was far from over. LeBron swiped his finger across his phone screen and reviewed the message once more before posting it. He knew there was no turning back, but he also knew this had to be done. His brother wasn't the only one. Malik was just another victim of a system that allowed guys like Miller to keep teaching. He took a breath and pressed post. The message was direct and forceful. It laid everything bare: the systematic abuse, the humiliations, the school's lack of action until he stepped in. It wasn't just about Malik. It was about all the kids who had ever gone through the same thing. "This has to change," was the final sentence of his post. The impact was immediate. Within minutes, comments and reactions started pouring in. Parents, former students, activists, and even public figures shared the post. Similar stories began appearing in the comments, some of them about the very same teacher, Miller. It was as if LeBron had lit a fuse that had been waiting to explode. The school quickly took notice of the storm brewing. The institution's official accounts were flooded with questions and demands for answers. How could this happen in your school? Why did no one do anything before? We demand justice for Malik and other students. The hashtag Justice for Malik became a local trend in less than an hour. LeBron's phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "LeBron James? This is Rick Saunders, a journalist from the Herald Tribune. I'm closely following what's happening with your brother and the school. I'd like to speak with you and Malik. I believe your story needs to be told in depth." LeBron clenched his jaw. He hadn't expected the media to move so quickly, but he wasn't surprised either. The situation was already spiraling out of control for the school, and the pressure was only going to increase. "My brother is not a media spectacle," he replied coldly. "That's not what I'm after," Saunders interrupted. "This is big. It's not just about your brother. There are more kids who have been through the same thing, some of them years ago. I think you know that. I've spoken to some former students, and many have stories to tell about Miller. The question is, do you want this story to have the greatest possible impact, or do you want it to stay on social media until the noise dies down?" LeBron didn't answer immediately. He looked at Malik, who was sitting on the couch, nervous, but with a relieved expression on his face. For the first time in weeks, he seemed lighter. Maybe because, finally, people were listening to him. "Let me think about it," LeBron finally said. Saunders didn't push. He just left his number and asked LeBron to call him if he decided to go ahead with the interview. When the call ended, LeBron turned to Malik. "What do you think?" Malik lowered his gaze for a moment, then lifted it with determination. "I think the story is no longer just mine. I think someone has to speak up." LeBron nodded. The decision was made. The scandal had grown too big to be ignored. The media pressure, the complaints on social media, and the students' testimonies forced the Department of Education to take action. In less than 24 hours, a formal investigation was opened into Professor Miller's conduct. The directive was clear: review his file and interview students and teachers who had interacted with him. The supervisor assigned to the case requested immediate access to the professor's disciplinary records. The first findings were disturbing. This was not the first time Miller had been accused of discriminatory behavior. There were multiple reports in his file, some dating back more than a decade. Parents, students, and even some colleagues had filed complaints about his treatment of certain students, particularly those from ethnic minorities. However, the school administration had never taken significant action. The complaints had been filed away under the label of minor incidents. No sanctions or severe warnings had been imposed. It was as if the system had protected him all this time. When the initial results of the investigation leaked to the community, the effect was immediate. Parents, former students, and other teachers began to speak out. Some shared their experiences on social media, describing similar incidents that had never been addressed. Others called the school directly, demanding explanations. The most shocking statements came from parents whose children had gone through the same ordeal as Malik, but had never received any support. In an impromptu gathering in front of the school, a group of mothers and fathers organized to demand answers. They wanted to know why Miller had been allowed to teach for so long without consequences. They wanted to know who had decided to ignore the warnings. And most of all, they wanted to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. As the pressure continued to mount, the school found itself at a crossroads. This was no longer just about Miller. It was about a system that had failed many students before Malik. And now, finally, everyone was ready to demand justice. Miller was sitting in front of the principal's desk when he received the news. Officially fired. No negotiation, no appeal. His record was irreversibly stained. The school could not afford any more scandals. "We must cut ties immediately," said the principal, avoiding his gaze. Miller felt a surge of rage. He stood up abruptly, but there was no one to yell at. His reputation was destroyed. The media had wasted no time in exposing every complaint, every ignored report against him. Online articles called him the teacher of hate. Social media videos compiled his worst moments. Parents, students, and activists cited him as an example of what needed to be eradicated from the education system. But Miller wasn't going to stay silent. A local journalist offered him a primetime interview, and he accepted. He thought he could clear his name. He thought he could justify himself. "This is all a witch hunt," he said, arms crossed, on the television set. "It's being blown out of proportion. I am not a racist." The interviewer let him speak. Then, calmly, he played a video on the screen, a compilation of Miller's own words in the classroom, his disdain for African American students. "Is this also being blown out of proportion?" the interviewer asked. Miller sweated. His jaw clenched. But he had no answer that could save him. What was meant to be his defense became his sentence. The public reacted with immediate outrage. His former colleagues publicly denounced him. What remained of his life in the city crumbled in a matter of hours. He tried to find another job. No one wanted to hire him. Every application he sent was rejected without even a response. The calls he made were cut off as soon as he mentioned his name. He couldn't walk down the street without receiving looks of contempt. A week later, he sold his house. He packed what little he had left into his car and took the highway. He didn't look back. There was nothing to recover. No one in the city wanted him there. As he drove, he turned on the radio. They were talking about the case. Today marks a precedent against discrimination in schools. A teacher who abused his power has been removed, and the community stands firm against racism, the announcer said. Miller turned off the radio. He stepped on the gas. He had to disappear. And this time, no one would miss him. Malik entered the school auditorium with his heart racing. The principal was on stage, holding an envelope with his name on it. Not a single murmur could be heard from the crowd of students and teachers. Everyone knew what was about to happen. It is an honor for us to recognize a student whose effort, dedication, and resilience have been exemplary, the principal announced firmly. Malik James, for your academic excellence in mathematics and your relentless determination, you are awarded the School Merit Scholarship. Applause thundered through the room. Malik stood up and walked toward the stage. His mind drifted back to the days when he doubted himself, when Miller made him feel small. But now he was here, not because someone had done him a favor, but because he had earned it. LeBron watched from the front row, a proud smile on his face. He didn't need to say anything. Malik already knew what this moment meant. He approached his brother as he stepped off the stage and hugged him tightly. "Never let anyone make you feel like you're less," LeBron whispered in his ear. Malik nodded. He understood, not just with words, but with everything he had lived through. When he returned to his seat, the classmates who had once mocked him were now patting him on the back. Some sincerely, others out of habit. It didn't matter. He was no longer the same boy who endured in silence. He knew who he was and what he was worth. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss more inspiring content. Share this video with friends and family who need to see stories that challenge perspectives and leave an indelible mark. Explore our channel to discover stories that inspire and transform. Until the next video. When the ceremony ended, he stepped into the hallway, where his mother was waiting with tears in her eyes. LeBron stood beside her, arms crossed, with a look of satisfaction. "Told you, bro. You're a genius," LeBron said. Malik smiled. It wasn't just a compliment. It was the truth. And this time he believed it too.